Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Welcome to the Fort Tabor, Fort Rodman Military Museum and Veterans Memorial. That name change just occurred Thursday night. I have the pleasure and honor of introducing Dr. Megan Kate Nelson today. Megan worked toward her BS degree at Harvard and her PhD from the University of Iowa. She's taught at Harvard, Brown, Cal State Fullerton, and Texas Tech. She's written 4 books. She's an expert on the Civil War and the Civil War in the West. Her third book, Three-Corner War, was a finalist for the 2022 Pulitzer Prize in History. Today, she is going to discuss the exploration and preservation of Yellowstone National Park, as well as the larger effort to unite the nation and assert federal power during Reconstruction. So, Megan, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you, Bob, for that introduction and for the invitation to come back. This is my 4th time here at the museum to talk about my various books and projects. So I always love coming here. Everyone here loves history and loves talking about it and learning about it. So thank you all for coming out today on this kind of wind-blown, weird spring day in Massachusetts. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Yellowstone and its exploration and preservation, but I'm also going to talk a lot today about the research process. Like, how do you find out about things like this? What do you go and do? What do you look at? Because this book, I started to do the research for it in March of 2020. I was in the National Archives looking at the records of the Hayden expedition, which I'll talk about in a second, when the archivist came to me and said, yeah, you may want to get what you need by Friday, because we're going to close for this COVID thing. And then she said, and I think we'll just be closed for like 2 weeks. I'm sure. And so, 2.5 years later, people finally got back into the National Archives. So the research process for this book was a little different than my research processes in other books. So can I just ask how many of you have been to Yellowstone? 2? Okay, now I should say this does not surprise me, because the closer I get to Yellowstone, the more the people have been there, right? A lot of people in the Intermountain West have been to Yellowstone, including me. These are vintage photos from 1982, taken with a real camera from back in the day. I was 10 years old, and we were on our 2nd summer trip in a car across the United States. This was our big trip where we went north. We stopped at Yellowstone first, then we went up into Canada and came down through the Dakotas and back to Colorado, which is where I grew up. So my parents really thought that we really needed to see, me and my brother, you can see him here looking awesome in his his headband, his Karate Kid headband here. They really thought it was important for us to see the nation and to see it on the ground and not just fly over it. Now at the time, I was a little angry about that because I just wanted to go to Disneyland and I did not want to have to sit in a car with my annoying older brother for 2 weeks, as you can imagine. But we went on about 5 or 6 of these kinds of trips when I was a kid and into my teenage years. And by the time I went to college, I had been to 44 of the lower 48 states in a meaningful way. And I think this is one of the reasons I became a landscape historian. I'm very interested in environments because I saw a lot of the country from a car window. And I also there was a coveted thing, which was to get into the front seat to ride shotgun with either my father or my mother, whoever was driving, and to be in charge of the map. And I love maps to this day. I draw the proto map for all of my books. I'm not a real cartographer, I wish I were, but this was a huge deal, right? Because it helped me find myself in space, but then it also meant that I would tell, it was the only time that I would ever tell my parents what to do. And they would do it, right? Turn right here. And they would. So very exciting for a young person to have that kind of power on a summer vacation. So these were sort of epic trips. So this was our first trip to Yellowstone. I went to Yellowstone again the next year because we kind of went up through there again to go over to the Pacific Northwest. But then from that point on, it was 39 years until I returned to Yellowstone as part of this book project. So for those of you who have been, and those of you who have not been, just sort of a refresher about where Yellowstone exactly is. Sometimes people are like, Yellowstone, Yosemite, Yellowstone, it's, the big Y parks. But Yellowstone is mostly in Wyoming, although there are parts of it that are also in Montana and Idaho. At 2.2 million acres, it is the second largest park in the lower 48. Anyone want to take a guess at what the largest is? In the lower 48?
Grand Canyon?
Death Valley, you are correct, sir. That is almost twice as large as Yellowstone, at almost 4 million acres. Huge park in California. But Yellowstone, 3 times the size of Rhode Island. If you've ever been, you know you can't really do it in a day, especially when there are 4 million people trying to get into Yellowstone basically in the same 4 months out of the year. This is another kind of element of Yellowstone. Unlike Death Valley, it is not fully accessible once it starts snowing in mid-September until it stops snowing in mid-May. There is the northern part of the park is open. You can still see Mammoth Springs, Mammoth Hot Springs, and one of the big valleys up here in the northern portion. And so you can see actually wolves in the wintertime, which is pretty cool. So you can go in the winter. You have to be able to walk on snow and ice, and you get by in these huge trucks with tread. But most of those 4 million visitors visit between May and September, which means it's super crowded all the time. It has 2 loop roads that are 2 lanes, and people are constantly pulling off the side of the road to look at animals usually, but also sometimes geothermal sites. So with 4 million visitors, Yellowstone is pretty much routinely in the top 5 most visited parks in the United States, and is pretty much in the top 5 or number 1 on most people's bucket lists also. And part of the reason for that is that Yellowstone really hits on all cylinders, right? It has canyons and waterfalls, which, we have out here on the East Coast too. Big lakes, they have the highest freshwater lake in the country, and largest in the country in Yellowstone Lake, where you can fish if you would like. And then it has all that charismatic megafauna, which is an actual term. It's a scientific term for all the big animals that are really cool that you want to see, right? The bison, the elk, moose, bears, and wolves. They reintroduced wolves into Yellowstone after they had gone extinct. They brought them back in the early 1990s, and that program has been really successful. And now there are almost 100 wolves in the park. And they generally, do whatever they need to do. If they stray outside, sometimes they can get in trouble with local ranchers, because of course, they don't pay any attention to park boundaries. And neither do bison. They go wandering around. But these are all the great sites of Yellowstone, but what makes Yellowstone really truly unique, not only in the United States, but also in the world, is its geothermal basins. More than 10,000 geothermal features in Yellowstone National Park. This is due to the fact that a caldera is there, a sort of shallow basin that is technically the top of an underground volcano. That is the result of 3 super eruptions over millions and millions of years. But what happened is that it brought a lot of these magma pools really close to the surface in this particular region. And so when it rains or snows, all that groundwater gets down close to the magma pools, it heats them up, steam rises and explodes out of the ground, or just makes the water bubble, depending. And depending on what kind of rock is there, you either get something like Mammoth Hot Springs and Grand Prismatic Spring, which have these kind of amazing colors, and in terms of Mammoth Hot Springs, cascades. Or you get what they call mud volcanoes. If the ground is clay, then the hot water comes up and just, there's explosions of mud everywhere. And in fact, Ferdinand Hayden, who I will talk about in a second, when he was exploring this region, he actually fell into a mud volcano, which burned, it kind of broke through the crust of the earth, and it burned the boots right off of his legs before he was able to get out. He had to walk back to camp barefoot with the pieces of his boots in his hand. So this is a dangerous place. Do not go off of the boardwalks when you are there, and do not approach the wildlife. They do not want to take a selfie with you. But this is, the geothermal regions are the big tourist attraction. They are the largest geothermal region in the world by a huge amount. And they are, this is the kind of the area of Yellowstone that Ferdinand Hayden saw first, and he knew immediately that this was unique in the nation and unique in the world. And it was also the center of the argument for making Yellowstone the nation's first national park. So why in the world would a Civil War historian write a book about Yellowstone? So this, my previous book, The Three-Cornered War, tells the story of the fight for the Southwest in the 1860s between US forces, Confederate forces, and Apache and Navajo peoples, mostly in New Mexico, but also in Arizona and parts of Texas and California. And for those of you who have read that book, you might remember that one of the protagonists in the book is the Surveyor General of New Mexico Territory, a guy named John Clark, who was appointed directly by Abraham Lincoln. And this was one way for Lincoln and his administration and the Republicans to kind of keep a hold on the West during the war, was to appoint civil officials, right? So New Mexico Territory was there, it did come in with the United States, and he sent John Clark there to be the Surveyor General, which means he was mapping the land in order to sell it, in order to figure out, kind of what to do with it. So when I was writing about John Clark, I was doing research into the history of surveying and surveys, which of course starts with Lewis and Clark in 1804. So I was thinking about it, and I was reading these things, and I was looking, and I was like, wait a minute. There's this Ferdinand Hayden expedition in 1871 of Yellowstone, which leads directly to the creation of Yellowstone National Park in 1872, which is legislation signed by President Ulysses S. Grant. So this is not, everyone associates national parks with Teddy Roosevelt, right? That guy just sucks up all the attention for conservation, right? But this is Ulysses S. Grant signing this legislation in 1872. So I was like, oh, well, that's kind of interesting. And then I thought to myself, because this was 2018, and I thought, wait a minute, the 150th anniversary is coming up of both this expedition and the passage of the Yellowstone Act. Like, that's sort of a big deal. We know, right? We just had the 250th of the Tea Party in Massachusetts, right? Boston Tea Party. And so these are moments, these are moments to celebrate. And I thought, well, that could be a good way to sell a book, right? So I wrote to my agent and I said, what about a book about, this kind of moment, this year-and-a-half moment of this exploration and preservation of Yellowstone? And her first question was, did anyone die? And I was like, man, you are harsh. And she's like, no, but what we want is conflict. And I was like, listen, this is all happening in the middle of Reconstruction. which is another thing people don't really think about, right? This is the period right after the Civil War. The southern states are trying to come back into the Union. The country is trying to get back on its feet again. There's still a lot of division. So why in the world would Congress give $40,000 to a federal surveyor, which in today's money would be $1 million? Why would they give him all that money to go and explore Yellowstone? And then why would they vote to create a national park? Why would they take that land out of territorial control and give it to the federal government? Why would they even be interested in doing that? So this was one of the driving questions. I was also interested in kind of, expanding my scope from the Civil War to Reconstruction to sort of think about the West during Reconstruction, because usually we only think about the South. Like, what was the federal government doing in the South? So, my agent came around, as did my editor. And so there were these three kind of pivotal moments that I saw. Saving Yellowstone, it really does only really focus on about a 1.5 to 2 year period. So it's a very close study of the people involved, who I'll introduce you to here in a second. Ferdinand Hayden was the first scientific explorer to get to Yellowstone, which he really wanted to do because he was a scientist, he was a geologist, and he was very ambitious. And he knew that Yellowstone was one of the last unmapped places in the United States. There had been all these rumors about it. Scouts and trappers had been telling stories about this place where water exploded out of the ground and all of this, mud volcano business, and no one believed them, right? Because they were scouts, they were trappers. They basically lied for a living. So why would they tell the truth about this? It seemed completely insane, right? Cliffs made of glass, yeah, right. So no one believed them, but Hayden thought something might be there based on his geological knowledge, and so he was like, okay, I wanna get out there, I need this federal money. The same session that the US Congress gave him $40,000 to explore Yellowstone, they passed an appropriations bill rider, which basically said that they would no longer sign any treaties with any indigenous nations. They were not, when you sign a treaty with someone, you are acknowledging that they're a foreign power, and they're like, they are not. They are domestic dependent groups and communities, so we will no longer be signing treaties with them. Which functionally meant the first kind of mode then, if you're not going to negotiate or sign a treaty, was warfare. So this is an important moment also in the history of the West, and as we'll see in Yellowstone. And then, in February of 1872, the Senate and the House of Representatives debated and then passed the Yellowstone Act. Again, creating the first national park in the world and doing something completely unprecedented, which was to take land from the territories and give it to the federal government to manage. Yosemite had been made a state park in California in 1864, right in the middle of the Civil War, signed into law by Abraham Lincoln. But that was giving California all of that land as state land to control as a state park, not as a federal park. So this was a huge federal land taking. At no other moment before this point had the federal government taken 2 million acres and put it into federal control. So why would they do that? And again, the context here is Reconstruction. This is during the first Ulysses S. Grant administration, his first term as president. Again, the nation is trying to come back together. And one of my big questions for this book was, well, okay, we already had Yosemite, right? We have Niagara Falls, there's the Natural Bridge in Virginia. Why didn't these become the first national park in the nation? And I think it hinges on the fact, from what I was just saying, about the uniqueness of Yellowstone National Park. They knew from the Ferdinand Hayden expedition, which produced a lot of records, which I'm going to talk about in a second, and a lot of photographs, visual images, that this place was essentially American, right? That no one else, no other country had a geothermal region of this scale and of this variety. It made the United States exceptional and unique. And when you're just coming out of a civil war and people need something to kind of bring them together, to think, yes, like our country is actually kind of all together, the continental United States has something that no one else has that's really positive and beautiful. I think that is what turned the tide in favor of Yellowstone in this particular moment. So I was looking around for who I could write about. Those of you who've read Three Cornered War know that I like to write history based on people's lives, so that I put you as the reader kind of on the ground with people, so that you're actually seeing them move through space and time and experience things. Because I think we often forget that the figures in the past were actual people, that they were like us. They were not just in 2D like these photographs would suggest, but they were in 3D. They were real people. They had desires, they had resentments, they experienced pain, they experienced love, and I want to show them for all of their complexity. And I prefer to actually write about people who are complex and have different motivations, often kind of befuddling ones, because they are, of course, super interesting to write about. So Ferdinand Hayden, you see here on the left, he is in a U.S. Army uniform because he was a surgeon during the Civil War. He was already a scientist by this point, a geologist. He specialized in fossils and fossil hunting. And he was living at the Smithsonian in D.C., in the castle, when the war began. And he really, really, really did not want to go to war. He was like, ugh, don't make me go. And finally, he got he was either gonna get drafted or someone was gonna force him to go. So he finally signed up. He did have a medical degree because most scientists did not have degrees in science at this time. It's not something that was even possible. So scientists would go and get a medical degree because that would enable them to take classes in biology and chemistry and things that they needed for the study of science. So he went and he was a surgeon. He was in South Carolina initially, and then was in the Shenandoah for the bulk of the war. And then when he got out, he was like, okay, I'm going to continue serving the US government, but also myself and my own ambition by becoming a federal surveyor. And at this time, it's important to remember, so this is before the United States Geological Survey existed. And so all of these surveyors, and you may have heard of a couple of them also, they had gone out, they were basically freelancers. So they would come to Congress and they'd say, I want to go explore the Grand Canyon, say. That was John Wesley Powell. I want to go explore the 40th parallel, right? So that was Clarence King. I want to go and explore just the larger West in and of itself, and that was George Wheeler, who was also a military man. And they would have to just lobby and convince Congress to give them money. And so they were in huge competition with each other, and they hated each other. Ferdinand Hayden, super ambitious, really scrappy. He actually grew up in Massachusetts, but he moved pretty quickly from here to New York. His parents got divorced. They were very poor. He was able to go to Oberlin because he did have an uncle who was invested in him, and he had shown pretty early that he was pretty smart, and so that he learned things quickly. But Ferdinand Hayden was one of these guys who you either really loved him or you just really didn't. He was a strong personality, let's just say. Very aggressive, very good at lobbying, extremely competitive and ambitious. And he wanted Yellowstone to be, the place that would put him on the map. So he successfully cultivated a lot of very important and powerful Republican legislators, including Henry Dawes from Massachusetts, whose son Chester he took with him on the expedition to Yellowstone. He took many of the sons of politicians with him, actually. He called them the political boys. And they were there to bear witness to the expedition and also to getting good with their fathers, and so that they would come back and tell their fathers everything that had happened on the expedition and be a sort of source of evidence. So he was very smart. He was very smart in the way that he ran his expedition. He was a very good manager of people. He let his scientists and all of their assistants kind of do what they needed to do during the collecting day, and give him a pretty long leash, and they loved him for it. They called him the professor or the doctor. That's how they referred to him in their accounts. So Jay Cook, who's here in the middle, was not someone I had initially kind of known about or connected with Yellowstone. He was an industrialist from Philadelphia, but very quickly kind of got into investment banking. He was super smart, very good at math, had an intuitive business sense, and was running his own investment bank by the time the Civil War rolled around. And he actually made all of his money during the Civil War because he is the one who ran the whole program to sell US war bonds to support the war effort. So he took a little percentage of every war bond he sold, and he made millions and millions and millions of dollars. So that he built a huge mansion outside of Philadelphia. He also purchased an entire island in Lake Erie and built a house on that as well, which still exists. And he had quite an empire here at this moment. But in the years after the war, he was really kind of searching for another project, right? Like, he loved the war bond project, not only because it appealed to his sensibility as a finance guy, but also because it was patriotic. He felt like he was doing something helpful for the nation, right? So he was looking for another project like that in the years after the war, and he came upon the Northern Pacific Railroad. Now, the Northern Pacific was chartered during the Civil War in 1864, along with the Transcontinental, the Pacific Railway. And it was supposed to be, it was nicknamed the Centennial Line. It was supposed to be finished in 1876 to celebrate the 100th birthday of the nation. And it was supposed to extend from the Great Lakes to the Pacific in Washington, and it was supposed to connect the Great Lakes to the Pacific Ocean. So Jay Cook was like, why don't I do that? I'll raise financing for this railroad. All of his finance friends were like, what are you doing? Just FYI, if you want to make money, don't invest in railroads. Terrible idea in the 19th century. Part of the reason for that is that you could get government funding for these railroads, but you had to build track first. So where are you going to get the money to build the track so that you can get the funding through land cessions that you can then sell to build more track? Well, Jay Cook, unfortunately, figured out fairly early that he was going to have to fund this himself. So he took money from his own investment firm to build Northern Pacific Railway track, and that did not go well, which I will talk about here in a second. But his railroad line was going to go north of Yellowstone, right through what is now the town of Livingston, which is where you kind of take the turn down to go through Paradise Valley to the northern entrance of Yellowstone. So he was very interested. He thought maybe he could take a lot of tourists this way, that there would be a lot of money in that kind of traffic. So he wrote to Hayden through his PR man and said, we are supportive of this whole project. We will support your expedition any way that we can. And of course, we'd like to hear about what you find. And, oh, by the way, we are sending to you a painter from Philadelphia named Thomas Moran. We hope you'll be happy to bring him into your expedition. And he's gonna, do some paintings of the area that we'll use for marketing our railroad. But you can also, if you need him for anything, just let us know. So Jay Cook was involved in this whole process, right? And I'll be showing you the importance of Thomas Moran here in a second. Now, the person who was sort of in the way, quite literally, of both Jay Cook's Northern Pacific Railroad and Hayden's aspirations to be the surveyor in the region was Sitting Bull, who was a Hunkpapa Lakota chief. His people's lands extended from the Missouri River all the way to the Yellowstone Basin. They were traditional enemies with the Crow, who had a reservation already near the northern entrance of Yellowstone, and they were fighting for possession of that country long before Hayden ever got there. And they were having none of this railroad building, they were having none of this tourist traffic, and they actually attacked and launched a campaign against all American traffic through their lands in the early 1870s. So he becomes this interesting voice, as you may remember, I told you about the 1871 Appropriations Act writer. The US government will no longer make treaties with him, right? So this escalates pretty quickly in the early 1870s and sends Sitting Bull and his compatriot Crazy Horse on the road to the Battle of Little Bighorn. So this is where that conflict begins. And so I thought that was a kind of interesting element, and it gets even more interesting because Sitting Bull's resistance to the Northern Pacific Railroad meant that Jay Cooke could not build his track. He made it from the Great Lakes to the Missouri River and did not build any track west of there because Sitting Bull's people would not let him. He attacked many, many groups of other railroad surveyors. And because he could not build his track, Jay Cooke could not sell any land in order to make back money for his investment bank. And when his investors came calling for their money, in 1873, Jay Cooke did not have it. He had to close his investment bank, and that launched the Panic and Depression of 1873. So, yeah, this is like one of those things where you start looking at a certain place or a certain event in American history, and you think, oh my God, it has all these connections to all of these other things that I had no idea. So how did I kind of build this story? How did I find these people? How did I understand kind of what they were doing in Yellowstone and for Yellowstone in the context of Reconstruction? So I'm just going to show you a couple of sources that I used to sort of get at this story. And as I told you, I started doing the research for this project in March of 2020. This was right after I published Three-Cornered War, so that book was out and I was promoting it. Then I had started the research for Saving Yellowstone, and I had exactly 1 week in the archive. And then I was at home in Lincoln, Massachusetts for 2 years, researching a book about exploration of the West from my own living room, and sometimes the kitchen table. So I had to do what I could with the sources at my disposal. So one of the great things that happened is that I was kind of talking about this problem I was having with sources on the site formerly known as Twitter, and one of the people I know on Twitter works for ReadX, which is a big company that does a lot of the digitizing of historical sources. And she wrote to me and she said, would it be useful to have access to the Congressional Serial Set? And the Congressional Serial Set is every single document printed by the government printing office for every single department ever. It's all digitized. You have to get access to it, through ReadX, but it's beautifully rendered. You can do word searches. And I said, oh, it would be very helpful. Thank you so much. And I tried not to, jump up and down, freak out. But I put Sitting Bull into the search field in the Congressional Serial Set. And I found him in the most unlikely places. And this is where digital resources, I'm going to talk about other kinds of resources and how useful they are, but this is where they are so incredibly helpful. Because I never would have looked at the statistics of mines and mining, this report from the Rocky Mountains in 1872, but lo and behold, as part of the report on Montana, there is a report just from a local official who's saying, we've not been able to do much planting, and it's because of Sitting Bull, a noted outlaw chief, not under treaty with the United States, who, mustered this group together, and they raided in the Gallatin Valley, kind of northwest of Yellowstone, and stole 300 horses, killed a couple people, stole other stock, and then rode off. They did this, by the way, when Ferdinand Hayden was in Yellowstone on his survey. They heard about this raid from inside Yellowstone. They were actually I think they were at Old Faithful. Yeah, they were at Old Faithful when they heard about this. So this is a report from someone totally unconnected to Yellowstone, someone you would never think of commenting on the growing power of Sitting Bull, and you can actually see he becomes, he had been a leader of his people for quite some time. He established himself on the warpath when he was quite young, but he was also a diplomatic leader and a religious leader for his band of the Lakota people. But he didn't really come to the attention of the United States until the late 1860s. And then you just see, if you put his name into that search field, you just see the mentions of him start to proliferate. And they're all over the place. They're from the military, they're from territorial governors, they're from people writing reports on mines and mining in the Rocky Mountains. So I was able to find, in addition to, there are lots of really great oral histories from the Hunkpapa and from the Lakota peoples themselves, testifying to the life of Sitting Bull and how important this period was for him as a leader of his people. But these documents were also showing me that the United States was recognizing how important he was, right? That he was messing with their plans. And that kind of determined the way that they were going to deal with him in reference to the Northern Pacific Railroad and Yellowstone itself. So one of the things, when the archivist came to me at the National Archives and told me I had like one more day, one of the things that I did, I had been looking through the Hayden survey records, which they would only let me look at on microfilm, unfortunately. Although they did have them in their actual material form in the archives, but they wouldn't let me look at those. I was looking at those. I very quickly just took pictures of the rest. And then I went to the Department of Visual Images and Print Documents and their map collection. Because one of Hayden's jobs was to map Yellowstone. And I should say, at the beginning, his goal initially was not to save Yellowstone. Federal surveyors were there to figure out what was actually there, and then how the US could possibly use it. Could they mine it? Could they farm it? Could they ranch it? What could they actually do with this land? And so he had a topographer with him named Anton Schoenborn, who was a military. He had been working for the US Army. He had been drawing and mapping military installations throughout the West in the 1860s. And so Anton Schoenborn came with him. He had a bunch of field notebooks. He took all kinds of readings and preparations to make his map. And tragically, Anton Schoenborn, nobody had really talked about this during the expedition itself, but he was a fairly depressed guy. He was not in a good way. The expedition seemed to cheer him up a little bit, but then he went back alone to Omaha, where unfortunately he took his own life after the survey got back. And so Hayden took all of his notebooks and gave them to another topographer. And you can see, this is actually quite tiny, so you probably can't see, but this map, which I found, I was able to look at the original in the National Archives, and it says that it is compiled and drawn from field notes and sketches by Anton Schoenborn. So this is actually from his data that someone else took and then created this map. So this was an interesting source for me for one of the kind of great tragedies of the survey. That Schoenborn did not live to see everything that happened because of his work, but this is kind of one of his products, and it's a big format map. I mean, it looks tiny on your screen, but it is a very, very large map, and it was important. Maps, as you know, as I was telling you, I love a good map, and maps are very important for the federal government to know kind of what is there and where everything is. It's also helpful for subsequent explorers to know what is there. I also used a lot of these ecoregion maps. These are maps produced by the USGS, which is, comes out of the federal surveying project in 1876. They were first created. And these are great maps. You can download them for free off of the web and look at where you are, where your town is, and it will show you what ecosystem you are in and what your soil is like, what trees tend to grow there. And as a landscape and environmental historian, I also want to put you on the ground in a really real way so that you understand what the land actually looks like, what trees might have been growing there at the time, wildflowers, things like that. So I use the ecoregion maps a lot to sort of give me all that good detail about place. Even though nature has changed over 150 years, a lot of the geology has not changed. So this gives me a good sense of kind of, you know, if I'm putting people in North and South Dakota and they're moving around and riding through, you know, where are the big rivers? How is that creating a sort of unique landscape for me to tell you about? Now, as I said, Thomas Moran, the painter, was with this expedition. William Henry Jackson, the photographer, was also with this expedition. Now, maps were important, but visual images were also important. Sketches of geological formations, photographs, and paintings, and as you all know, I am sure the Civil War was a really important moment for the development of photography, so to speak. But because this is where photographers started going in the field, they created mobile darkrooms so that they could go with armies into the field and depict these places, right? So William Henry Jackson had not been a wartime photographer, although he too was a Civil War veteran. He fought for Vermont and fought with a Vermont company during the war and then went west afterward, had been training as a photographer before the war, loved it, was really good at it, and created a photography studio in Omaha. And his first engagement, his big kind of commission, was to take photographs of the Transcontinental Railroad tracks. The Union Pacific hired him to document that railway. So Ferdinand Hayden had seen his photographs and thought they were really great. And so he took Jackson with him on the survey before this to Wyoming, and then he got him to come to Yellowstone again. So he took over 400 images of Yellowstone. Photographs are important. I mean, nowadays, we know that much of what we see on Instagram or on various social media, on Facebook, those are manipulated images, right? You can tint things, you can crop them, you can change them, you can do all sorts of things now, and especially now that we've got ChatGPT, we can do all sorts of things with photographs, right? In this period, people really believed, even though these things, you could manipulate them to some extent also, they believed photographs to be the truth. That if you had a photograph of something, that meant it was real. So it was super important that Hayden had this photographer with him because that was evidence, right? If no one believes you that Mammoth Hot Springs exist, then you show them this photograph, right? So William Henry Jackson is there from the beginning. He takes all these photographs. This guy who's out there in the middle of Mammoth Hot Springs, if you can see him in his little shape right here. So he is there for Jackson to give you a sense of size, right? A sense of scale. That Mammoth Hot Springs, this is just one part of Mammoth Hot Springs, and it's huge, right? Because you can see that there's a guy there. Now, the fact that he sent this guy out onto this structure, which is basically kind of thin layers of crystallized kind of rock, with hot water cascading over it. And they're quite near the top, so the water would have been extremely hot. It got cooler as it went down. But he was really risking his life to clamber out there on this structure. And this guy is Thomas Moran, the painter. Because he and Jackson, of course, got along. They bunked together, they traveled together. Jackson would take photographs and Thomas Moran would sit beside him and take sketches and watercolors. And he just sends him out there like, so I think we came really close to losing one of our nation's foremost landscape painters during this expedition because Jackson was like, oh, why don't you pose there on the edge of the canyon? Why don't you go out onto a geological feature through which you could fall and be boiled alive? Fantastic. But this was in fact hugely important. Thomas Moran did not die. In fact, he came home from the expedition to paint this painting, the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone, along with with many, many other watercolors. But this was his big piece, and by big I mean really big. So this is a 12-foot by 8-foot canvas. And people who saw it in exhibition when it first came out, you had magnifying glasses so that you could see the detail. One of the details is those two people standing out on the precipice. Right here. Okay. So there are others, you can't see them because they're in shade, but there are a couple horses here. And there are two other figures who are William Henry Jackson and Thomas Moran. This guy here, so that's meant to be Ferdinand Hayden. And then the gentleman standing next to him is supposed to be an indigenous guide. There was no such guide on the Hayden expedition. They had a couple guides and hunters, but one of them was local, one of them was Latino. They were not indigenous. So this is something that Thomas Moran sort of made up, right? So that there was a tradition in landscape painting and in this whole idea of manifest destiny, that indigenous peoples, this may have been their land, but they were showing Americans the way, right? They were the guide, they were going to give this land to the United States, and then they were going to disappear, right? So that was the point of this figure, kind of in this image. But the rest of the image is so dominated by, this is the lower falls of the Yellowstone, and Yellowstone Canyon, and the Grand Canyon. And this painting really knocked everyone's socks off when it was exhibited in May of 1872. This was after the expedition came back and after the passage of the Yellowstone Act. And Moran actually was able to sell this painting for $10,000 to the Library of Congress. It was the most that the library had ever paid for any piece of artwork, and it was the most that anyone had ever paid at all for an American painting at the time. So they hung it in the state capitol for quite some time, then it went to the Smithsonian. It is now in the Department of the Interior, if you want to go and see it. And this painting made Thomas Moran's name on the national stage. You may have seen many of his other images of the Grand Canyon, of the Mountain of the Holy Cross. He specialized in these sort of large format Western images. And I should just say that this image is on the cover of Saving Yellowstone, of the book, and then another Moran painting of the Grand Canyon is on the cover of Three Cornered War. So, Thomas Moran I was delighted to be able to write about him in this book and to write about art and the making of art, because it is so important in how we understand our American landscapes and American history. So diaries and letters, our stock in trade as historians and people interested in the past. This is the stuff we really love. This is the stuff we hope to find in people's attics, right? Like that no one has ever looked at before, these amazing diaries and letters. This is, in fact, a letter I was able to see, again, just in microfilm format at the National Archives. As a federal surveyor, Ferdinand Hayden had to submit everything. His receipts, letters, reports, everything, specimens. He sent 45 boxes of specimens to the Smithsonian from this expedition. And then he had to file everything with the federal government, so they have it all. They have all of his letters and all of his reports handwritten, and everything that he received in relation to this expedition, including this letter. From October 1871, this was after the expedition was over, and Hayden was just getting back to his office at the Smithsonian, and he gets this letter. As you can see, it's from J. Cook and Company, the offices of the Northern Pacific Railroad. It is from A.B. Nettleton, who was his PR man, J. Cook's PR man. And it says in it, we understand that you had a marvelously successful expedition to the Yellowstone. And we were just maybe thinking, wouldn't it be a great idea if you approve to maybe in your report, because Hayden had to write a report, to submit to Congress to sort of say, this is how I spent your $40,000. Wouldn't it be great if you included in that report an argument that this should be made into a national park? Now, in my family, we call that a requestion. Would you like to set the table? That sort of thing. We know what that is, right? So it was a requestion. J. Cook and Company, very interested in perhaps this national park idea because it would bring tourists, right? There's this whole myth about Yellowstone that where the national park idea came from. And the myth is that it comes earlier, that there were local explorers who were talking about it and said about, no. It was the idea of a PR guy for a railroad. Now, Hayden, though, knew a good idea when he saw one, right? So he was like, oh, that would be excellent. Not only would it save Yellowstone and prevent, because people were pretty traumatized about what had happened to Niagara Falls. Because at this point, Niagara Falls had just turned into one of those like horrible tourist maelstroms. You guys have been to some of these sites, right, where it was all kitschy and gross and awful, and no one could ever see the falls in their natural splendor, so they wanted to save Yellowstone from that fate. Hayden also wanted to keep Yellowstone as a national laboratory, as a place of scientific exploration and inquiry, right? This was pretty self-serving. He wanted to be able to go in there and do geological studies and get fossils and kind of publish papers and do that sort of thing. But he also wanted it to be available for other scientists as well, to do all kinds of collecting and all kinds of studies. So he began to lobby pretty much immediately. J. Cook helped him. He was a friend of Ulysses S. Grant, he and his brother Henry, and so they lobbied for the Yellowstone Act to be passed, and one of the ways that they did it is they took a couple of Thomas Moran's sketches, and they took several of William Henry Jackson's photographs, along with some specimens, and they set them up in a little kind of tiny museum exhibit in the rotunda at the Capitol. And so when they went in to talk to senators and congressmen, they would say, and if you want to see, just go out and look at this exhibit, right? And then Hayden published his big kind of 350-page report of the expedition itself in February, and distributed that to all of the legislators as well, so that they had all the documentation of what this place was. And there was a lot of debate, there was a lot of discussion. The passage of the Yellowstone Act was not unanimous. The vast majority of Republicans, and in this moment, as I think you all well know, the parties were sort of flipped. So the Republicans believed in big government, big programs, things of that nature, internal improvements, and Democrats did not. They believed in states' rights and keeping things local. 89% of Republicans voted for the Yellowstone Act, 70% of Democrats voted against it. So it was not unanimous, right? And the two arguments that people who voted no made should sound a little familiar. One was, this is federal overreach. Because the federal government for the first time is taking land away from the territories and giving it to the Department of the Interior, this should not be happening. This is too much, right? But this too was part of Reconstruction, right? The federal government is sort of extending itself and extending its power in the South and the West. So that argument didn't really go anywhere. The other argument was, you cannot take land that could be developed out of the hands of the people. We hear this argument today as well, right? Both of these arguments are still with us today about why there should not be either state parks or national parks or setting aside of any kind of land. So that was interesting to me. I hadn't realized that, actually. When I started reading about the debates, I was like, well, this is interesting. These are arguments that have survived also for 150 years, right? In addition to Yellowstone National Park. So the other thing I like to do is go on site visits to go actually see where these events in the past happened, see what these places look like now. And sometimes these kinds of visits can be really transformative. So I should note, I'm not out there standing on the structure. I am on the boardwalk. Now, parts of Mammoth Hot Springs, it looks a little bit different than Henry Jackson's photographs, because a large part of this structure is actually now dead. The water table is not high enough for the water to get to the top of some parts of the structure, which is about half a mile wide. And scientists believe that this is going to remain the situation. And this is due to climate change. This is due to the fact that even though it is still snowing quite heavily in Yellowstone National Park during that kind of winter season, it's not snowing as much. And the rain comes earlier and washes it all down. And so all of those kind of steamy vaults right above the magma are not getting as much water. So a lot of the features are dying. And they will continue to die, right? So I didn't actually get to, so I had planned a trip to Yellowstone, which has it's one of the few national parks that has its own archive on site, and also a big museum, a big national museum. And I was gonna go do research there in May of 2020, canceled. September, rescheduled it for September, canceled. And so I didn't actually get to Yellowstone until 2021. So almost exactly like 39 years after my last visit. So I went there, I forced my husband, I was like, 4 days in Yellowstone, we're going to all of the places the Hayden expedition went. And he was just like, oh God. Like by the 4th day, he was like, ooh, like I may have had enough. And in fact, one of the cavalry men who wrote a diary who was, and they were with the Hayden expedition in the field, was like, yeah, after 2 days in the Geyser region, he was like, yeah, I've seen a lot of these now. I think I'm done. That's a lot. And so, yeah, my husband sort of fell for that guy too. But what was interesting is that I had not realized, when people talk about the landscape, sometimes they miss details or they don't actually tell you certain things. They'll say something like, well, we rode uphill, and then suddenly they called it the Frozen Cascade or the White Mountain. They didn't call it Mammoth Hot Springs. The Frozen Cascade sort of leapt into view. And I didn't really know what they meant until we actually drove up the hillside from the northern entrance. It's 1,000 feet high. Like you go up this very, slightly scary road that is very steeply pitched. And so these guys were riding their horses up this very steep pitch to get to the top of this plateau where they could finally see Mammoth Hot Springs. And this was one of the features that Ferdinand Hayden was the first to record. There were a couple other kind of locals who had been through in the years before and had described and given a name to Old Faithful. They had been to the canyon of the Yellowstone and seen the falls and things like that. But no one had seen Mammoth Hot Springs. And it was because it was so high, you actually literally couldn't see it from the riverbed. And that was something I didn't understand until I was actually there, like in the field. So I always try to visit the places that I write about just to make sure that I have the details correct, or to sort of get another kind of new view of that place and why people were talking about it in the way that they were talking about it. So, what do we learn about the nature of national parks, our great American national parks, 63 of them, big nature parks, and then hundreds of historical parks, battlefield parks, and other parts of the National Park Service. So what do we learn about them by looking at Yellowstone? Well, one of the things is that we should not take them for granted, right? I mean, the fact that these arguments are still in play about why national parks should not exist is really important to know, and to know kind of, that there are still people, even though we kind of, I think, in general tend to think of national parks as a public good and as something that makes America really unique, there are people who don't think that. And so we still need to be, if we believe in national parks, we need to be their stewards, and we need to not assume that they will just always be there, because they may not, right? Also, I think it's really interesting to know that Yellowstone is still a scientific laboratory in the way that Ferdinand Hayden had hoped. Because the United States saved Yellowstone as a national park in 1872, and then because they built a couple of national forests around it, including Gallatin National Forest and Custer, it is the largest intact ecosystem in the world, and of its zone type, the sort of temperate zone ecosystem. And so scientists come there from all over the world to do all sorts of studies of animal life, of trees, of rivers, of climate change, because they're able to see an undisturbed landscape. It's been undisturbed for 150 years, just going through natural changes, right? So I think Hayden would have loved that, right? Like, he would have loved that people are still doing scientific studies. And in fact, right now, there should be going on, I think next week, every 2 years they hold a scientific conference at Yellowstone. And it's all studies that are based in Yellowstone or Grand Teton, which is right to its south. Very cool. I went in 2022, and it was super fun. Totally unlike any history conference you've ever been to. Like, there was one guy doing otter research, so we got to watch otter videos, of them sliding down in the snow into the water, having a good time. So that was awesome. So science is still very much a part of Yellowstone, but so is disagreement, right? And then also I think, national parks have histories. I think if we, often we're just like, oh, it's a national park, we're gonna go and enjoy it and whatever. But each national park has its own totally fascinating, really complicated history. Why did it get saved? Who voted for it? Who voted against it? What is it supposed to be saving for us in terms of an experience and in terms of a really kind of unique or interesting or kind of just really beautiful space? And that I think is key, because I think a lot of times, especially if you watch documentaries, I was very disappointed. There was a whole national parks documentary, I think it's narrated, I think, by Barack Obama, and it has all this great nature in it, and no history. And again, it's like these national parks just emerged, just fully formed, that no one had anything to do with it, right? It wasn't the act of a particular group of people in a particular moment. Lots of people have written about Yellowstone from a lot of different angles, but I think we have much more to learn about our national parks and what they tell us, not only about how much we value nature, but about these moments in history in which people cared enough to save it. Thank you. Question, yes ma'am?
Meg, is there still a passport that you would get stamped when you go to all the national parks, do you know?
Yes, they have a passport, and you can go along and they will stamp it for you at all the national parks, yes. And it has 63 little elements, and some people also do stickers, and I think they also have maps where you can kind of put your little decal in every time you go to one of those national parks. Yep. Yes, sir.
Did the railroad ever get in there, or the telegraph?
The railroad was finally, great question, the railroad was finally built in 1883. It was supposed to be finished by 76. Jay Cooke went bankrupt and was not the one to finish it. But he did ride on it in the early 19th century, or sorry, the early 20th century, like 1901, and rode on it from the Great Lakes to the Pacific coast. And of course was like, oh, this is my project. Isn't it great? Didn't I do such a good job? But yes, and when you look at the visitation records for Yellowstone, from 1872 to 1883, about 1,000 people visited per year, because it's really hard to get to, right? It's still hard to get to. Like, you have to fly in to Bozeman, or to Cody, Wyoming, or to Jackson, Wyoming, and then drive for a long way, like an hour to 2 hours, just to get into the park. And then the park is huge, right? So it's still really hard to get into, but until 1883, until they finished the Northern Pacific, going just north of there, only 1,000 people a year, and then you see it jump to 10,000. And then once they start carriage lines, and then they build a spur line down, and then you see the numbers really start to go up. Because access is everything, right? This is why, I mean, Alaska has all the hugest national parks, gorgeous, amazing, and the least visited.
Yeah.
Yes?
The old trees, are they being cared for, or are they falling apart?
Well, Yellowstone itself has had a lot of fires. So they had a really big fire in the 80s that took out a lot of trees. And that, of course, is part of, fire is part of the natural process. And trees are supposed to burn down and then kind of spread their needles and grow anew. And so you'll go through the park and you'll see kind of sections that are the 1980s forest, the new forest, because they're not as big as the rest. And then you'll also see some that I've called ghost forests, like where there's still, it's more recent fires and smaller acreages that have not burned to the ground and are just left standing there. But Yellowstone does not have any of the big trees, like the redwoods. It does not have any of those big trees. But those ones are saved at Sequoia, General Grant National Park, and at Redwoods National Park. And those are all still there. And they rarely, I think most of them are doing okay. They are feeling the effects of climate change because they are such huge organisms. But as far as I know, they have withstood kind of that, and then also any kind of insect infestations, and then also fire, because they actually like fire. Yeah.
Do they have the old sequoia trees?
Yellowstone does not have any sequoias because of where it is, but those are all in the Sequoia and General Grant and Redwoods. Those are all the big tree parks are pretty much all in California. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And they're beautiful. If you have a chance to go there and see those are amazing also. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Just wondering, did you get your husband on the ledge of the canyon?
I did not. We tried to reenact these ones. We tried to kind of redo those. It didn't quite go well. I mean, I look a little bit like, you could we couldn't figure out except for this one on the left, that's the verge of the lower falls. And so I have many pictures of me standing against that rail, but my brother was not with us. And it's not quite the same. But I do remember very vividly that feeling of being on that verge and feeling that pull of the water kind of going over. And I loved it. My brother looks kind of like, and I'm like, yeah, let's hang out here all day. Let's do it. Yeah, but no, I did not force him into anything. But I do have another really great photo from 5 years before, at the Grand Canyon, where my parents, in a complete, like, ridiculous 1970s parenting move, put us like on the edge. And again, I'm sitting there like, and my brother's like, and then they also they took us up to this other like ledge and then left us there and walked back down to take the photo. And again, you can't see the expression on our faces because it's like 1970s cameras, but I was like, yeah, and that's why Gen X has grown up the way we have, yes. Lives continually in peril. Yes. Any other questions?
Good job.
The early pioneers, when they were going across the country, is that documented in the history when, if they ever got close to?
The only, John Coulter was the only, he was kind of the first American to see Yellowstone, and he had been with Lewis and Clark. And then he had gone kind of back with another couple trappers and wandered around, got lost, and ended up in Yellowstone. And he was the first one to sort of talk about it, and of course no one believed him. But there wasn't, because Yellowstone was so, again, so difficult to get to, you could only really, in this period, go in that northern entrance. There was not any way to get in from the east or west or south. So you had to go up all the way around, and any of the sort of the typical pioneers who were moving from east to west were on the Oregon Trail, and they were much further south. They crossed the Rockies through southern Wyoming, and then they went up, so they would not have gone past. Indigenous peoples, though, knew all about Yellowstone, and they had been using it as a thoroughfare and a place to hunt and to gather medicine for thousands of years. So they were there, and they knew it was Shoshone, basically Shoshone and Crow, but also there are 27 tribal nations that have a historic relationship with Yellowstone that are recognized by the National Park Service today. And that, thank goodness, are increasingly working with the National Park Service to bring those histories into the park. But there was not any of the kind of classic things that you think of in terms of the Oregon Trail or the Mormon Trail or any people going for the California Gold Rush or the Colorado Gold Rush. They never went into Yellowstone. Even the people going to the Montana Gold Rush of 1863, which is right during the war, they didn't go into Yellowstone either. Because again, it was super hard to get to, and it was very forbidding. No one knew what was gonna happen. And in fact, Hayden and all of the guys who were on the expedition with him, who kept records, would talk about how they're on horseback and they could hear the echo. Once they made it into Yellowstone Basin proper, where the caldera is, their horses' hooves would make this echo, and it was because the land was hollow underneath them. And they talked about also, they would put their heads down, to sleep and camp. They could hear the water boiling.
Whoa.
And so, and if you got too close to an edge, you could fall in. And Hayden did in that one case. So it was they wrote about those experiences, so people knew it was dangerous and that you shouldn't really go in there unless you were prepared. And you should never go in there before the end of May or after September, or you would get snowed in and you would never leave. So no, they didn't, there was no real exploration or tourism again until the 1880s.
Wow.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you very much.